Now for this lesson, we are going to look at the configuration of a PLC5 chassis. Unlike most of the other Rockwell PLCs, certain things have to be set on the chassis via dip switches. Before we do that, however, there is just one more controller which I would like to show you. Here is the Ethernet PLC5 controller. This one is a 520E, showing the key switch, the Ethernet indicators. Channel 2 is your Ethernet communication. As you can see, it's a D-shell plug socket arrangement. You get an adapter to go into there so that you can come out with an RJ45 connector, which is the normal one for Ethernet cables. Then, of course, you have your serial and your DH plus channels as well. Your battery, your processor, your force indicator, channel 0, which of course is serial. If you have a memory module, this is where it will be located, and the battery behind this battery holder here. Then we have a look at a 580E. It does exactly the same thing, but there are certain things in slightly different places. The channel 2 Ethernet is in the same place, but your channel 0 is just to the right of it, which of course is your serial. Then you have your 1A and 1B connections and the status indicators. Your battery is at the bottom. And you've got all your indicator lights, your battery, your processor, your force light, and channel 0 comms, they're all there as well. So remember, for Ethernet, you do need an adapter, and that will plug in to this shell connector, and on the output, it is an RJ45, just like a normal Ethernet connector going to a switch. Now, let's have a look at the switch assembly settings for your PLC5 chassis. These are very important. If we look at this is switch assembly 1. We have 8 dip switch positions. And if we look at dip switch position 1, if it's on, the outputs will remain in their last state if your controller fails. If it is off, the outputs will switch off. 4 and 5, very important. Here is where you set your addressing mode for your I/O modules. If they're both off, you are using 2-slot addressing. If 4 is off, 5 is on, you are using 1-slot addressing. If 4 is on, 5 is off, you are using half-slot addressing. And remember, once you address this chassis, it is for the entire chassis. You cannot have part of a chassis 1 slot and another part of a chassis 2 slot. Once you set it, it relates to the whole chassis. If you have an EEPROM, switches 6 and 7 must be set. If they are both off, the EEPROM will transfer to the processor at power up. If they are both on, it will transfer to the processor if the memory is not valid. And if 6 is on, 7 is off, it does not transfer to the processor at all, if in fact you do have an EEPROM fitted. And of course, switch 8 is for processor memory protection, either disabled or enabled. Now, these notes reference what I've previously explained to you. Regardless of switch 1's settings, the outputs are reset when there is a runtime error, when you have a fault on the backplane, or when you select program or test mode. And the status file bit will be reset to a local rack. If the EEPROM module is not installed, the processor LED light blinks and the processor sets status word 11 bit number 9. That is the major fault status word, S11. we will be discussing these in some detail in a different lesson. Number 3 is when a processor fault occurs if the memory is not valid, and 4, you cannot clear the memory when that switch is on. Now we're getting to switch settings again for switch assembly S1. This switch is at the bottom of your controller. DH plus, station number 1 to 6, that's what your switch is, and baud rate is switch 7. On is 57.6, off is 230.4. The most popular is on. So we will have a look at the next slide and see what these station numbers are all about. Switch assembly S1, this shows the switch positions. Here we see station numbers 0 to 7, 10 to 17, 20 to 27, as you can see, all in octal. And these are the switch positions to give you the addresses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And in this instance, you see on here, it goes right up to 70 to 77. Here we have switch assembly 2. There's the switch underneath. There are 10 dip switches there. And on this one is for the 51120, 511, 520 and 520E. And the one on the right is for 530, 540, 560, 580 controllers. And again, the switch positions are the same as the previous illustration. Here you set whether you want serial, RS232, or RS422 or 423, and you set your dip switches accordingly. The most popular would be RS232. What about Ethernet configuration? Now, when we're using an Ethernet controller, there is a jumper which you must set. Now, 802.3 will be the normal setting. 802.3, incidentally, is an 802.3 project that was developed and created many years ago to take care of the various communication protocols. So here we see when it's to the right, we're looking at 802.3, which is the one you would most probably use. There is a hardware address label on the controller. This, in fact, is called the Internet address or the MAC address. This is what it's commonly known as. It is 6 bytes long, displayed in hexadecimal. And the first 3 bytes represents the manufacturer's ID. The next 3 bytes represents the ID of the device itself. What about the power? Remember, we have 2 power supply options. One is a chassis power supply. The other is a remote mounted power supply. And you have to select. On your chassis, shown here from the front, yes means it's a chassis power supply. No means it's an external power supply. That must be set correctly for your operation. Here it shows it, chassis, mounted, external. And you cannot power a single chassis with both. You have to select one or the other. You can't have both. Very important. So I hope that's given you some idea how you can set up your PLC5 chassis. These settings must be made in every case. There's no exception.